Prince William did not enter the room as a son preparing to discuss his father. He entered as the future king, carrying a truth that could no longer remain behind palace doors. Catherine stood beside him, silent but visibly shaken, as he confirmed that King Charles had approved a formal abdication timeline. The crown was not changing someday. It was now moving toward a fixed and painful end. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had summoned the most senior household figures to Windsor under strict secrecy. Phones were removed before the doors closed, and every advisor understood that nothing spoken inside could leave the room. Catherine watched her husband take his place at the table, knowing this meeting was not about another temporary transfer of royal duties. Those arrangements had been prepared before, allowing others to carry out responsibilities when the monarch could not. This was different. This concerned abdication, the formal and permanent surrender of the throne. The prince allowed the silence to deepen before speaking. Then he delivered the words no one was ready to hear. Charles had approved an abdication process that would begin within 6 months, with the final transfer of sovereign authority planned before the end of the year. That authority meant the legal power held by Britain's reigning monarch. Once transferred, the king would no longer rule, and his eldest son would inherit every burden the crown carried. Catherine heard the change in William's breathing when he finally said, "The king will step down." He paused afterward, caught between two identities that could no longer remain separate. The heir was accepting what duty demanded. The son was confronting the decline of the father he had spent his life trying to understand. One advisor quietly asked whether Charles might reverse the decision. William kept his voice controlled, but his hand tightened around the back of a chair. He answered that the timeline had not been forced upon the monarch by constitutional officials. His father had personally requested a fixed date after receiving a private assessment that changed how he viewed the future. Catherine then broke her silence through a documented account prepared for those present. She revealed that the family announcement had been delayed for several days because Charles insisted on speaking privately with Queen Camilla first. The Queen Consort had been told before the wider household, and whatever passed between them had left both deeply shaken. William placed a sealed red folder on the table, but refused to open it. Every date inside, he said, had been approved in his father's own handwriting. The timetable was now clear. The reason was not. The abdication date had been fixed, but behind that date stood a father, a son, a wife, and a future queen, each carrying a different version of the same heartbreak. The monarchy could describe abdication through laws, signatures, councils, and ceremony, but no official language could explain what it meant inside the royal family. For Charles, it was the surrender of a destiny he had waited decades to fulfill. For William, it was an inheritance arriving too soon. For Catherine, it was a duty expanding overnight. And for Camilla, it felt like a future being taken away. King Charles had spent most of his life preparing for the crown. He had endured decades of expectation, criticism, and uncertainty before finally becoming monarch, the sovereign who serves as Britain's head of state. Now, after waiting so long to begin, he was preparing to let it go. Abdication might sound like a change of position, but for him, it meant admitting that determination could no longer defeat time. Charles sat alone in his study after the family meeting. He removed his glasses and stared at the first page of the timetable without turning it. Every date represented a duty he would perform for the final time. Every deadline moved him closer to becoming a former king, while he was still trying to understand what his reign had meant. William carried a different burden. He had always known the throne would eventually become his, but he had expected years of preparation under his father. Instead, the transition was now being measured in months. Catherine found him beside a darkened window late that evening, silent and unable to rest. When she asked what frightened him most, he admitted the truth. He felt guilty preparing to receive the role his father was grieving to release. Catherine understood that his guilt would not remain his alone. The transition would immediately move Prince George closer to the direct pressures of succession, the ordered line determining who inherits the throne. Her son would still be a child, yet every decision around him would suddenly carry greater weight. She knew William was becoming king too soon, and George was being pushed toward the same future even faster. Camilla carried her own wound. She had been informed before the prince, creating a painful undercurrent between the king's wife and his heir. William could not ignore that she had been trusted first with the most important decision of the reign. Nor could he accept, without question, Charles's request that the Queen Consort retain a protected royal status after the abdication. The exact privileges attached to that protection remained unresolved. Camilla finally asked her husband whether he was certain. Charles reached across the table, covered her hand with his, and answered, "I am certain only that I cannot leave this until it is too late." Those words changed everything. The abdication had not begun with a document or a constitutional warning. It had begun when the king faltered at the exact moment the nation expected him to stand firm. For weeks, the palace explained the king's reduced schedule as a precaution. The family accepted shorter appearances, altered routes, and private rest periods without asking the question nobody wanted answered. Then came the Commonwealth Oath ceremony at St. George's Hall. Charles rose to deliver a pledge he had spoken many times before. But halfway through the page, his voice stopped, his hand trembled, and William stepped forward. King Charles had already surrendered more duties than the public understood. Several engagements had quietly passed to William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward, allowing the monarch to preserve his strength without creating alarm. The Commonwealth Oath ceremony was a formal gathering where the sovereign publicly renewed a promise of service to nations connected through the Commonwealth. Charles insisted on attending because, in his mind, continuity depended on the crown appearing steady, even when the man carrying it was not. The king began with control. Then he lost his place. He searched the page, tried to continue, and found nothing. William saw the fear before anyone else did. When his father silently gestured toward the final passage, the prince stepped forward and completed it before the assembled officials. The ceremony continued. The monarchy did not pause, but something inside Charles had already broken. Charles finished the remaining formalities and withdrew into a private antechamber, a small room used for preparation or retreat beside a ceremonial hall. He refused assistance, closed the door, and remained alone for nearly 20 minutes. No aide entered. No advisor spoke. Outside, William stood with the knowledge that he had just taken his father's place before an audience that understood exactly what it had witnessed. William felt no triumph. He felt exposed. Later, he told Catherine through a private recorded conversation that finishing the oath had not felt like preparation for kingship. It had felt like witnessing an ending while everyone pretended the moment was still under control. She listened as he admitted that the silence after his father stopped speaking frightened him more than the ceremony itself. Charles made his decision that evening. He requested the sovereign transition files, emergency papers prepared to guide the transfer of royal authority if a reigning monarch could no longer continue. It was the first time he had asked for them voluntarily. On the first page, the king added a handwritten note. The monarchy must never face another public moment in which uncertainty reached the throne before preparati ondid. Catherine visited Charles the following morning. He admitted that watching William complete the oath had shown him something painful but undeniable. The crown had continued without interruption, even while he stood unable to speak. His son had protected the institution. Yet, in doing so, the prince had also revealed how close the ending had become. The ceremony convinced the king that succession could not be delayed. But when father and son finally faced the timetable together, duty collided with wounds neither man had spoken aloud. No advisors remained in the room. No secretaries waited beside the wall. Charles sat at one end of the table with the abdication file before him, while William stood at the other, refusing to take the empty chair. What began as a discussion about dates quickly became something far more personal. A confrontation over fear, sacrifice, and the unspoken belief that one man was surrendering while the other was advancing. King Charles wanted the transition completed within 4 months. He argued that uncertainty would weaken both the government and the royal household, because an unclear transfer of authority could leave officials unsure who carried final responsibility. The abdication file contained the legal timetable required to end one reign and prepare the next. To the monarch, speed meant control. To his son, it looked like a family being forced to change before it had even understood the cost. William asked for more time. He did not ask because he feared becoming king. He asked because Catherine would become queen beside him. Their children would move closer to the centre of succession, and every institution around them would have to adjust at once. Schools, security teams, charities, and household staff would all be affected. The future king knew the crown could survive a rapid transition. He was less certain his family could. Charles heard hesitation and answered with anger. He accused the prince of treating the timetable as negotiable after spending years demanding a more modern and decisive monarchy. William did not raise his voice. He simply replied that he had wanted reform, not his father's disappearance. Only then did he sit because the king's expression had shifted. The anger was gone. What remained was hurt. Charles pushed the red folder across the table and told his son to choose another date. William did not touch it. He pushed it back and said the final date had to belong to the man leaving the throne, not the one preparing to receive it. The words landed harder than either expected. The monarch finally confessed what had driven his urgency. He feared remaining too long and being remembered as a sovereign whose family had to conceal his weakness. William answered with his own private fear, recorded later in a confidential account. History might portray him as the impatient heir who benefited from his father's suffering. Neither man wanted victory. Both feared judgment. Charles removed his signet ring, the personal seal traditionally used to represent royal authority, and placed it beside the folder. For one terrible moment, William stared at it. Then the king slowly put it back on. He was preparing to leave, but he was not finished yet. Father and son could argue about timing, but beyond that locked room, the Crown's advisors were already deciding which choices still belonged to them. An abdication may begin with a monarch's decision, but it cannot be completed by emotion alone. Behind the palace walls, constitutional advisors, legal officers, senior courtiers, and government representatives began constructing a path that left no room for confusion. Every sentence mattered. Every date carried consequences. Yet at the centre of those calculations sat one exhausted man listening, as others explained how his reign would formally end. King Charles heard the process described in cold, exact terms. Parliament would need preparation, security arrangements would change, succession plans would be activated, and a proclamation would eventually confirm William as king. A proclamation is the formal public announcement that establishes a new monarch. The sovereign could choose to step aside, but constitutional procedures still had to carry that choice into law without leaving the nation uncertain about who held authority. The pressure tightened when senior advisors warned that the public timetable could not be treated as flexible. Once announced, any reversal would damage confidence in both Charles and William. The king understood the danger. A failed abdication would make him appear indecisive and leave his son trapped between loyalty and ambition. The future king would inherit suspicion before he inherited the throne. Camilla refused to accept the speed without challenge. She demanded guarantees that her husband would not be reduced to a retired figure without influence, dignity, or access. The Queen Consort argued that Charles had given his life to the institution and could not simply be removed from its inner workings. Her anger was controlled, but everyone in the room heard the fear beneath it. Charles remained silent until an official read from a draft scenario and called him the former sovereign. His expression tightened. He asked for the phrase to be repeated. Sovereign meant the reigning monarch who holds the crown's legal authority. In that moment, the title sounded less like an explanation and more like an eraser. The shock deepened when a Privy Council document revealed that Charles would lose normal access to state papers after abdication. He had approved the timeline without fully understanding that restriction. State papers are confidential government documents prepared for the reigning monarch. William quietly intervened, requesting regular personal briefings for his father without creating the appearance of two competing royal courts. Catherine noticed the king folding the corner of one page again and again. She gently removed the file from his hands and asked the room for a pause. She protected Charles without publicly weakening him, and he allowed her to do it. The pause changed nothing. The legal structure was becoming clear. But when the new order entered the private rooms of the family, constitutional necessity began to feel like punishment. The abdication had not yet been announced to the nation. Yet the palace was already beginning to move around it. Briefing boxes changed routes. Security teams received new instructions. William's office gained authority over decisions that had belonged to Charles only days earlier. The transition was meant to protect the monarchy, but to those losing access, influence, and identity, it felt as though the king were being erased while still wearing the crown. William's team gradually took operational control, so the future monarch could assume full responsibility without disruption. Operational control meant the daily power to approve schedules, staffing, security, and official decisions. Catherine also began receiving expanded briefings on state ceremonies, patronages, household appointments, and the expectations attached to becoming queen. Each file prepared her for duty, but every new responsibility reminded her that another woman was being pushed aside. Camilla discovered the change through her diary. One of her scheduled meetings had been transferred to Catherine's office without a personal explanation. The Queen Consort read the altered entry twice before confronting Charles. She asked why everyone else appeared to know what she was losing before she did. Her anger was not only about one meeting. It was about becoming secondary before the abdication had even begun. Charles told her the changes were unavoidable. Camilla removed her diary from the table, closed it sharply, and replied that inevitability was not the same as kindness. The king heard the accusation beneath those words. He had promised she would retain dignity. Yet the institution was already treating her future as an administrative problem. The pressure worsened when a revised household plan revealed that Charles and his wife would have to leave their principal palace apartments within weeks of the abdication. Those apartments were the official private rooms used by the reigning sovereign and the immediate household. Catherine quietly warned William that forcing his father out too quickly would transform a constitutional transition into a family humiliation. She understood that buildings could carry identity, and removing the monarch from his rooms too soon would make his departure feel like expulsion. William entered his father's working room later that day and found staff placing labels on archival boxes. Charles was not present. The prince immediately ordered them to stop until the king personally decided what would be moved and what would remain. No box, he said, would leave without his father's consent. Charles learned of the order through a private household report. For the first time since the timetable had been approved, he saw protection rather than impatience in his son's actions. William had not defended the office. He had defended the man. The machinery of succession had separated them, but one quiet act inside the king's working room finally gave Charles and William a reason to speak without anger. Late that night, Charles asked William to meet him without secretaries, advisors, or even the red folder that had dominated every conversation. There were no constitutional phrases left between them, no prepared statements. For the first time since the timetable was created, the king did not speak about the monarchy. He spoke about regret, lost time, and the fear that surrendering the crown might also mean losing his place within his son's life. William joined his father in a private sitting room after the household had withdrawn. The prince had spent days protecting Charles's dignity in public, while privately struggling with the speed of his own approaching reign. A sitting room was simply a private family space removed from official meetings and formal duties. Here, neither man could hide behind advisors. Here, every silence belonged to them. Charles admitted that he had mistaken his son's caution for reluctance. Worse, he had feared William saw the abdication as an opportunity he had been waiting to seize. The king spoke slowly, as though each word carried years of buried doubt. He had spent a lifetime waiting for the throne. He could not stop wondering whether the future king had spent his own life waiting for him to leave it. William answered without anger. Becoming king had never frightened him as much as becoming king because his father could no longer continue. He did not fear the crown. He feared what it would cost Charles to surrender it, and what accepting it too quickly might make the world believe about them both. The king then apologised for St. George's Hall. He confessed that forcing the prince to complete the oath without warning had been unfair.